Hi, I want to include some short notes on Chapter 9, which is about spatial analysis of three-dimensional data, and also about interpolation, or filling in missing data when you don't have a complete set of point values, say for elevation. So just a little bit of background. When we talk about 3D and GIS, one thing to kind of think back about is that coordinates have X and Y values, like on a Cartesian coordinate system that we would use in geometry that we've discussed before. And that's what is the coordinates that are recorded in vector data or calculated in raster data. But they can also have the Z value or height as well. And this doesn't have to be just about elevation, that any kind of continuous surface for temperature or elevation below sea level or what have you can be considered a Z value or a height. But it needs to be some sort of a continuous value. Okay, how do we, so just some nuts and bolts, how does a GIS store three-dimensional information? One way that you can is through vector data. That vector actually has a structure called a TIN, or triangulated irregular network, where what this represents is these are point values. The points have a Z value or elevation associated with them. And what it does is create a set of triangles in between these points that are called facets. And these facets are just sort of a three-dimensional triangle that is kind of created in between these point elevation values. This is kind of, this is in some ways used for other kind of graphical design, like making video games as well. But if we don't have a complete set of values, let's say we want to find out what the value is in between some of these points, then we would have to interpolate that information. This is just showing some ways that we can display 3D information. And in the book, when it goes through different methods, it kind of uses the same area to show you different examples. But this is a triangulated, a TIN, triangulated irregular network. It looks kind of just scrambly. It doesn't really look like much. It's created from LiDAR points. But a couple of things we can do. We can apply a hillshade. So an analytical hillshade creates artificial shadows to show you, give you a 3D effect. We've discussed that in class. And here's another way. This is using color coding to show heights. And so the color coding can be used as well. Now, with raster, it's a bit simpler, but what I'd like to do is take this opportunity to talk about interpolation. So here we have a TIN, and here we have a raster. But with a raster, you can't have gaps. You need to fill in data for all of the different cells. And so if you want to know this cell here, how do we know what to call that? Well, one thing we can do is look at some of the other nearby points and use different methodologies to fill in that gap to try to interpolate that value. So this is called spatial interpolation. It's identifying the Z value, such as elevation, based on adjacent control points or neighbors. And there's different methods to do it. We'll talk briefly about them. Some are very common, some are a little more advanced. So there's nearest neighbor, which is the simplest method of just sort of finds the closest point and kind of takes its value. Inverse distance weighting, which kind of is a little bit more mathematically involved, kriging and splining. And whichever method you choose will give you different results, because they're using different methodologies to come up with, fill in those missing values. So here, this is showing the slope, and just kind of displaying the slope. That's been with different ways of interpolation. Slope being, how steep it is. The aspect, sort of like which direction it's facing. And you're going to get a little bit different results depending on the methods you use. Okay, so let's talk about some of those methods. Nearest neighbor fills in the gap using n nearest control points, and n is how many neighbors. You can pick that. And so the idea is that you would find, for this one, you would find, say, 4 nearest neighbors, and then it would mathematically say, okay, well, what's the distance, what are all these distances, and find the closest one, which is number 7 here, and just take the value for number 7 and apply it to this point. So really, you're just saying, find the closest known value, give me that value. It's very simple. Here's a closer view of that point table below. You see, so for, in the example in the book, if your closest ones are the first 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, but the very closest one is number 2, then you just take the value for number 2, and that missing value is 104. Now, inverse distance weighting is a little more complicated, and what this does is take advantage of, this is something I meant to talk about in class, Tobler's first law of geography. And the idea is that everything is related, but closer things are more related than things that are further apart. And so you could use that to your advantage by simply saying, well, if you're going to fill in a missing value, you're going to give more weight to those points that are closer to you and less weight to those points that are farther away from you. And so there's a lot of math here, but essentially you're using a whole set of neighbors, but you're giving higher weight to those that are closer to you than those that are farther away from you. And there's different ways that you can kind of tweak this analysis to assign how the closest ones, how much more important they are, a minimum distance, that sort of thing. But essentially you're kind of using a set of neighbors, but you're relying more on the closest neighbors. Now, geostatistics, it is a bit more complicated. In fact, there's a whole extension to ArcGIS called geostatistical analysis. And this is a special branch of spatial statistics that is a little bit like inverse distance weighting, but it accounts for more statistical stuff. So spatial autocorrelation means that, kind of like Tobler's first law, things that are close to each other tend to be more alike. So if you look at, say, if you're sampling incomes, if someone is sampling you and your neighbor and a neighbor after that, those aren't independent samples, because people who live in the same neighborhood tend to have the same level of income, generally speaking, because they are spatially autocorrelated. So you can kind of adjust for that and use that autocorrelation to be another factor that you use to interpolate the missing values. And the idea is that there is some point where things are not independent, and then after some range, values are independent samples from each other. They're not influenced by that distance from each other. So without going into a lot of detail, I haven't really used this very much. It's a little bit more advanced. Also called Kriging in some places, but this may be a better way to look at it. If we look at the distribution of the LiDAR points, that as we go, if we look at the values, and as we go further away from each other, when they're close, they're a little bit more clustered, and as they're further away, they tend to be less clustered. There's less autocorrelation, and you can use that to help the interpolation process using some advanced statistics. And the fourth method is using splining. And splining, this comes from a way of, so if you want to adjust this piece of wood here, this is a spline, like a curve, and you have what are called ducts. These things are used to kind of hold that curve into place. And so if you know the value here, you know the value there, you can kind of imagine that along this curve, you could interpolate values along that curve and kind of fill in the gap, rather than just using the value of the points and their distance. So here's another way to look at it. These are different control points. their height, and their distance from each other. And so you can construct, say, just a bunch of straight lines, and then this value would be along that line. That sort of this would be a linear interpolation, meaning you just make straight lines between them. Or you could use some sort of a function to create the curve that would give you a slightly different value. And then this is kind of using a different method, but the idea is that you kind of connect a curve through these points, and then you use that to interpolate the missing value. All right, stay cool out there. I'll talk to you soon.